Thank you.
I call the Monday, July 9th, 2018 meeting of the Portsmouth City Council, which is a work session, to order. Now I ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Yes, sir. Mr. Clark.
Here.
Mrs. Lucas Burt. Here. Mr. Moody.
Here.
Ms. Simmons.
Here.
Mr. Smith. Here. Okay. Dr. Whitaker.
Present.
Mayor Rowe.
Here. Dr. Patton.
Yes. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of City Council. On June 11, 2018, the repeal of net neutrality regulations became official, allowing providers to regulate traffic content based on service or destination. The absence of regulations potentially allows the creation of fast and slow lanes or pay-per-view business models. The first presentation this evening, Mr. Daniel Jones, the city's Chief Information Officer, will provide an update on the repeal regulations of net neutrality. The second presentation is an overview of the mosquito control program. Mr. George Wojak, Assistant Director of Public Works and President of the Virginia Mosquito Control Association, is the presenter. In the audience for this presentation is Mr. Keith Lockwood, Chief of Operations for the Army Corps of Engineers and the city's new Public Works Administrator overseeing the Mosquito Control Division, Mr. Timothy DuBois, who is the Vice President of the Virginia Mosquito Control Association. Yes, members of council, in the city we have the state's president and the vice president leading the city's mosquito control division. The third presentation provides a background for the City Council on the Virginia Department of Transportation sign program. The city's business community in the historic Old Town District inquired on how the city could assist in highway destination signage could be addressed. Mr. Vincent Jones, Deputy City Manager, is the presenter. The fourth presentation, Mr. Solomon H. Ashby Jr., City Attorney, is returning this evening to address City Council's prior inquiry as it relates to insurance requirements for Civic League-sponsored activities. The presentation is the final update for City Council before the ordinance modifications addressing parades, demonstration, and First Amendment activities will come before you for consideration. The final presentation discussion, City Attorney Solomon H. Ashby Jr. will also provide a brief overview of the Historic Preservation Commission appeal process in advance of two appeals that you will be hearing during tomorrow's public work session at 5:00 p.m. Mr. Jones.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council. This evening I will provide a brief presentation regarding the repeal of net neutrality regulations that were effective on June the 11th, 2018. This presentation this evening will define net neutrality, the net neutrality regulations repeal, any legal or legislation concerns, the connectivity method, and our citizenry impacts. So just to revisit, the net neutrality is the ideal principle or requirement that internet service providers, or ISP, should or must treat all internet data the same regardless of its source or destination. Since the repeal on June the 11th, broadband is now classified as an information service instead of a public utility as it was prior. And that is a Title I non-utility. It is now legal for ISPs to legally block, throttle, or prioritize content at discretion, but it must be disclosed publicly on a public website or reported to the FCC where they will make it public there. In addition, this requirement was similar to net neutrality laws, except that it exempts smaller ISPs from any reporting requirements at all. The enforcement of any net neutrality violations will now be handled through the FTC instead of the FCC, which is the Federal Trade Commission versus the Communications Commission. Currently, 23 state attorneys general have filed suit, which includes Virginia, California, New York, District of Columbia, as well as some major technological companies as Facebook, Netflix, and Google. Currently, New Jersey, New York, and Montana have enacted state-specific net neutrality regulations, which are currently law. California lawmakers just recently reached an agreement to have the strictest net neutrality regulations, including zero rating. Now, zero rating is defined as when a carrier offers either free or financially subsidized programs or services. So if you hear cellular commercials, will give you a year free of Netflix, or year free, you can use HBO Stream on our network and it doesn't count towards your data gap. That's a zero rating. It's a way to provide services that maybe other carriers may or may not have access to. As well, the U.S. Senate passed Senate Joint Resolution 52 entitled Restoring Internet Freedom with a vote of 52 to 47. Currently, that joint resolution has been conveyed to the House, where it is still awaiting further decision. However, the FCC repeal that went into effect on June the 11th included a preemption clause. That preemption clause said that no state, local, or municipality government shall enact any type of net neutrality laws. The validity of that is still to be determined. As you can see, several states have basically ignored that preemption clause and went ahead by passing state laws in accordance with their own legislation. So currently, bandwidth throttling has and is currently occurring on wireline and wireless services. So what that is, when your transmission of data encounters network slowdowns, bottlenecks, not intentional, but just a fact of the usage and the capacity, that's the same thing we're talking about here. Whether it is wireline or wireless methods, both transmissions required a wired infrastructure. So if you have a wireless device, of course, it's going back to a cellular tower, where then it transforms to a wireline infrastructure and completes the transmission.
Say that again, please.
Okay. Whether you're on a wireline or wireless, it all completes through a wireline infrastructure. So all the cell towers, when you communicate or you use data through your cell phone, it goes back to your closest tower, your point of origin, and then completes through the connectivity that they have at that specific tower. So most carriers will have fiber at a closest tower. Then once the signal hits that tower, it completes the transmission to the internet through that fiber backhaul. So as we see, currently just the low bandwidth intensive applications, FaceTime, Netflix, Facebook Live, and this excludes any and all 5G autonomous applications. So right now there is an opinion, capacity issues, infrastructure has not kept up with the pace of technology. So in essence, the net neutrality is really a capacity issue. Because if you have plenty of capacity and you're not using any of it, there is no reason or business model for you to throttle, block, prioritize. But if you do have capacity issues, then you want to prioritize and have that space as a premium. Now the citizenry impacts, currently we foresee this being as a status quo of the reversal. This is too hot of a subject for a carrier or an ISP just to come out and blatantly say that we're blocking or we're throttling or prioritizing traffic. Now, within a time frame, I would suspect probably that it will slowly creep its way in through different avenues. Packages like your pay-per-view, you have access to certain sites because of bandwidth transmission, high intensity or high capacity bandwidth. You'll get tiered as a larger customer rather than just a normal everyday user as far as bandwidth. How we help alleviate any of the net neutrality repeal is basically provider competition. If you have more providers than are currently available to most of the U.S., except for certain places, most urban areas have only 1 to 2 carriers. And then some rural areas have none or even 1 carrier. So if carriers start this practice and you only have 1 carrier, or the choice of 1 to 2, you don't really have a choice. Because depending on what part of Portsmouth you live on, you can have access to Verizon or you can have access to Cox Communications. But very, very limited segments of Portsmouth, you have access to either or. And with the expansion of infrastructure comes autonomous systems. This is just the so-called tip of the iceberg for your 5G, your driverless cars, your Internet of Things, your IoT. Any questions?
Lisa?
Yes, I guess after everything is set and settled and they determine who the providers are, I mean, is it going to be an additional cost that citizens and residents will have to pay to utilize their current internet services or any other Netflix?
That is not out of the realm of possibility. That is once the dust settles, and as it continues. You recently seen in the news the big merger and acquisitions that are happening. As those carriers keep narrowing down to the big conglomerates, then they're going to control most of the space. You have AT&T now that has or will have access to all the HBOs, the Discovery channels, all that. So when you have a provider that can provide that content on their network, and if you're on another carrier and you want to access that content, then that sets up the place to drive it or to slow the access into their content. I'm not saying that they will or they won't, but it sets up the opportunity.
Other questions? What impact does this have on voice communications?
Voice communications, as far as voice
Cell phone.
Voice communications over a cell phone.
Voice communications require a lot less bandwidth. They're very less bandwidth intensive applications. I wouldn't foresee that having any type of impact on voice. Because your bandwidth is your Facebooks, your Netflix, things of that nature.
Which one would you like to use?
Other questions? Comments? Thank you, sir.
Mr. Wojak, Mosquito Control Program.
There we are. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of the council. This evening I will provide you with a brief overview of our mosquito control program here at the City of Portsmouth. Here on our cover slide here, that's our typical spray truck that we have in the City of Portsmouth. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Our program operates year-round here, okay? Our peak season runs March through November, and our staff that work full-time also do the dreaded snow detail. I know we talked about that a few months ago. We also assist with stormwater operations as far as cleaning ditches and stuff like that during the off seasons, if you will. The program is based on surveillance. And what do I mean by surveillance? We have to have a way to measure mosquitoes. And if we took 10 people in this room and we took them out and said, what do you think mosquitoes are like here? We get 10 completely different answers, okay? So we have to standardize that. So we use traps, set them out in the locations for 24 hours, pull them in, count them, identify the mosquitoes. Then there's no bias, okay? And we do that all across the city. And from that information is what we use to determine when and where we need to do treatments, okay? One of the other things that we'll do is it's really important for us to monitor the weather. And we're monitoring the weather now and what they're forecasting for the next week, if it's correct, even into the next month, because we're really interested in the rainfall. We're looking at winds, we're looking at temperatures, because that all drives whether or not we can treat or if we need to treat. The city is broke up into 9 spray routes, as you can see here. There's a few areas here that are not highlighted in spray routes, and that's mostly because there's not roads there or it's federal property. And those are the areas that we pretty much concentrate with the aerial program. We have 2 spray trucks, like you saw in the picture before, that have larviciding sprayers mounted in them. And those larviciding sprayers are used primarily in the daytime to treat standing water in roadside ditches, storm drains, catch basins, and any other low areas that we can access with a truck. So those are the activities that are done daytime. Nighttime, we have 4 trucks set up to spray for adult mosquitoes. And that's what most people think about when they hear mosquito control is, I need to see the truck fogging down the road. That's only a small portion of what we actually do. And it's the last thing that we do. Each route that we have up here basically can be done in 3.5 hours. And the reason why we do that is we want the application at a specific time when the mosquitoes are most active. That's when we're going to get the most effect. That's when we want the biggest bang for the buck. Weather permitting, if everything's good, we can do all the routes in about 3 nights. And I say weather permitting. By law, if it is raining, we cannot spray, period. If the winds are over 15 miles an hour, we cannot spray. Ideally, we like to have the temperatures between 60 degrees and 80 degrees, which we can have 60 degrees and 80 degrees anywhere from March all the way through November, even into December sometimes. Most of the time we don't have to treat in December, but it has happened in the past. This is actually a view from inside one of our trucks. All of our spray trucks are running top of the line. We have GPS tracking. Here's a handheld unit that's actually sitting in there, and there's a map on there. This is the console that controls the spray operation, that the driver has to operate a bunch of stuff as they're driving down the road. They need to know where they're going in the route, and they need to know if they've made an application on the street and you start getting turned around, you get confused. Did I spray this street? Did I not spray this street? This map will actually show them where they have gone, where they have sprayed. So it gives the driver something real quick as they're coming up on a road. They can say, okay, I've already hit this street, move on to the next one. Or if they haven't hit it, they can come back and spray it. If somebody's out walking, our policy is we'll shut the sprayer off, we'll move off, and we'll try to come back in there and spray it afterwards. The other thing, we have beekeepers, local beekeepers. They're not commercial folks, but they have bees in their backyard. We try to do our best to avoid those. If they call us and give us their name and information, we will actually log this into the map, and when they get within 300 feet of the property, an alarm goes off inside the truck. The spray operator knows immediately, I'm coming up on something. They can look on the map, they can see, hey, there's a beekeeper, I need to shut this off. They move on, start the sprayer up, and keep on going. The other advantage to this is all this information is recorded. This is actually a computer here. This records all the fancy stuff on the sprayer itself. How much is the pesticide pumping out, what time, and all that other stuff. And it is linked to the map, so we have that information, which is good for us because it meets or exceeds our requirements for the state and the EPA. Aerial spraying. Aerial spraying is a joint program between the city and the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a benefit to both of us to treat the bigger areas at the same time with the same chemicals, so we're both benefiting at the same time. There's 2 main things that we have. This yellow plane here is a contractor plane, and Contractor plane actually does 3 different kinds of applications for us. First one is the larviciding, or the targeting juvenile mosquitoes. And that's the one that you'll see an announcement will go out that says we're going to be larviciding, it'll be on this day, and we'll get calls and they'll say, I never saw the plane. You're never going to see the plane on larviciding because it's only out over Craney Island for the most part, or it's over the city property and it's way away from people. You won't see it. The guy's usually done, pilot usually has it done between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning. He's usually finished and moving on. That can be done during the day. Again, larviciding can be done during the day. For the adulticiding, same plane, it's different configuration, different chemicals. That is done maximum of 2 hours before sunset. Okay? It takes them about an hour and a half to spray our entire route that we have mapped out. That's pretty much the most that he can possibly do in one shot. And there's a little bit of cushion in there, so if we have to delay because of weather or something like that, we can do that. Third thing that's up here is the invasive plant species. That's something that we're targeting with the federal property and the city property. We've got some invasive plant species that actually take over, they clog drainage up, and it's a big hindrance to us. So it's helpful to have that partnership with the Corps, because if we have an airplane or a helicopter that's here at the same time, we both benefit because we're doing everything and we're not having to bring it in individually.
So you spray the herbicide from the plane?
The herbicide can be done with a plane or a helicopter. Most of the time it's done with a helicopter because the pilots, we could give him a GPS coordinate of this table right here and he would put it right here on this table. We target areas the size of this room regularly. The other one I have on here is the Air Force, the reserve unit. Everybody remembers we used to have them come in 3 times a year. That hasn't happened lately. We had them in here once last year, which was great. They actually have switched over. They're doing night operations, which is completely different than they were. Most people do not see that plane, but I guarantee you that if that C-130 flies over your house at 300 feet, you know it was there.
Yeah.
We have 2 dates tentatively scheduled, and I say tentatively scheduled, the end of this month and then the end of August. How do I explain this? They're tentative dates. As we get closer, if they are going to be here and everything's confirmed, we put out our announcements and everything else. These are reserve and active duty military. If they get deployed somewhere else, which is what happened to us last fall, we had them on the schedule. We had to delay because of the hurricane. They bumped us onto the schedule with Charleston, and then had to bump both Charleston and us off because they got deployed down to Texas post-hurricane work. So we have them on there. If they can come, it's great, but it's not our primary thing. We still have the contract assets that we can use, and that's our primary. Okay? Okay. With all of our applications, whether it's aerial adulticiding or ground-based stuff, we do post information on our mosquito spray hotline. We update that. So if we put out that the larviciding is going to be done on Tuesday, as soon as that's done, we will update that message. So citizens could call. They don't have to talk to anybody. They can call and get the message and see that it's been done. They can also find out what routes are being sprayed tonight. So if you were to call us right now, you would see that we actually have two routes on the schedule for tonight. So that's all I have. Are there any questions?
Couple of questions. I want to congratulate you the way our mosquito, I guess, operation has evolved since about 2002. It's come a long ways. But a couple of things. Are we testing for West Nile?
We currently are not sending samples for testing. It depends on the state whether or not they're going to take them. And Mr. Dubois and I have been talking about that. They are taking samples right now, and we may be sending samples. I can tell you that just because you don't find it in samples doesn't mean you don't have it. So it can give you a false sense of security, okay? Best thing to do is use the insect repellent, long sleeves, avoid the exposure, dump your containers out, okay? You need to treat them as if they are infected, because just because you tested them and they don't find the virus doesn't mean that it can't be there. It just is that one sample that you found didn't have it.
Right. A lot of people, and I think you've explained this before, some of us remember the old fogging trucks that we used to
Run behind.
Yes.
Highlight of the day.
Waited on the side of
They
the
used to
road.
tell me that'd make your hair fall out. I just knew that was false.
Right out
But,
there and let us do it.
Obviously, the truck goes by a lot faster nowadays. Why is that? Is there a difference in the type of spray or
Yeah.
the dispensing unit?
Yes, sir. It's a completely different spray. The old technology was we're going to spray pesticide onto a hot manifold and make smoke.
That's what
And you had 90% of the product that was out there that you could see was not doing any good.
Right.
If it's a smoke particle, it's too small to actually kill a mosquito. Our sprayers are calibrated every year. We have a annual calibration on the droplet. It's part of the label. So we know exactly how many droplets we have, and we test randomly to make sure that we're getting the control that we're supposed to be getting. We're putting out right now about 1 ounce per acre, which is a very small amount. You wouldn't think about it. It's a small amount in the grand scheme of things. It takes 1 droplet, roughly the size of a pinhead or a piece of hair, to kill a mosquito. You can hit them with 5 droplets, but you only need the 1. So we really try to put out only what we have to put out.
Right. Thanks.
Other questions? Yes.
Mayor, I did not ask Mr. Keith Lockwood, who's Chief of Operation from the Army Corps of Engineers, to stand. Could you stand? And I'd like to say that Mr. Wojak in Public Works works very closely with the Corps of Engineers, and we have a quarterly meeting, but they are meeting often, and he's out, the team is out at Craney Island, so the working relationship is outstanding with the Corps, and we really appreciate all the work you do for and with us.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, I echo Councilman Moody's remarks on our strong partnership over the 15 years. Since 2002, we've really grown a good, strong partnership. So you do have years, even with the best control program, you have Mother Nature like last year that just everything didn't go right. Sorry. The things just lined up with a really warm spring and winter and then constant rainfall. And so last year we got hit in the mouth a little bit, but you stay true to the program and just get ready for it the next year. And this year, actually, Mother Nature's been very good to us. And we had sort of that, it was a warm February, but then a cold March. And not as much frequent rainfall. We've been drying out, so even though we're ready to go with our treatments, we haven't had to do so because the mosquitoes just haven't really grown to that population size yet. But we're monitoring, as George mentioned, and I expect later this month we'll be hitting it hard at Craney Island on the federal properties and jointly. So. But no, it is a great partnership, and the quarterly meetings also, we always mention that as well, so thank you, Dr. Patton.
Yes.
Well, again, thank you for the partnership. And Bill, you got a question?
Yeah, one question. I recall when the cells were active out in Craney Island, it was less of a breeding ground because they were filled with water. And when they aren't, they breed in the fissures in the soil out there. Are they active now? Or?
So we have 2 cells that are active, the south and north, and it's a really good point. And actually, also the timing-wise, we had projects that were active this winter. So by pumping in dredge material over those cells, you had an egg base in the fall that just got wiped out. So they had to start all over. Whereas in the previous years, we had 2, we may have 1 or 2 drying out over the winter, and so you get those eggs will come out over the winter and hatch. The center cell has been drying out, and it is a balancing, trying to manage the capacity of Craney Island. You want it to dry out to allow for compaction, so the water removes. So, and that's where we actively really monitor those cells that are drying and get those cracks, and then treat those. A big also thing, and George mentioned this as well, is the herbicide treatments. Years ago, also some of the cells that were drying out were overtaken by an invasive reed, Phragmites, and that allowed for more water to stay and more habitat for mosquitoes. And now we actively treat that, and so it's more like a moonscape. So you still can get mosquitoes growing there, but you don't have that vegetation and shade and cover for them to really thrive.
Very good. Thanks.
Other questions? Again, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
And also, Mr. DuBois, would you please stand so council can at least see you didn't stand before? And he is the Vice President of the Mosquito Association, and today is his first day at work in the city of Portsmouth. So welcome.
Very nice.
All right, we will now have Mr. Vincent Jones to come forward with the Virginia Department of Transportation sign program presentation.
Yes. All right. Good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Simmons, and members of council. This evening, I will provide a brief overview of two programs, the Virginia Logos and the Virginia Supplemental Guide Signs Program. They are both administered by a contractor, Virginia Logos, which is a national outfit. The Virginia Logos program is paid for by individual businesses, and the supplemental guide signs are paid for by municipalities and any associated tourism or cultural related organization. A
Is that a
review.
one-time payment or monthly payment? What's the,
It is an annual payment that the businesses make, and it's actually based on the exit and the traffic count at that exit. So traffic count of annual average traffic count over 40,000 trips daily requires a $1,000 annual payment. Below that is about $800.
So somebody like a McDonald's would pay different amounts at different exits.
Exactly.
Oh,
Yes.
wow.
but everybody would pay the same for that particular
For that
exit.
particular exit. And the exits in Portsmouth all have the higher traffic count, so you're looking at $1,000 annually.
And does the establishment have to be a certain
all right.
distance from the exit?
Right. They try to make sure that you cannot be more than 3 miles away from the exit.
That's in his presentation.
All right. Okay. So we reviewed the Logos program, and it revealed that the city's businesses are represented on I-264. Again, I mentioned the traffic count. The VDOT 2017 average daily traffic count estimates that the logo signs and where they are located in Portsmouth see an average daily traffic count of 73,000 trips, and that's right at our Effingham exit, which is the most in Portsmouth. And then we actually have a sign referencing Portsmouth on 264 in Norfolk at exit 12, and that sees over 100,000 trips daily. Right. So I'll briefly review each exit, and starting on I-264 at exit 2, we'll come back toward downtown, which is exit 7. Exit 2 is Greenwood Drive. Exit 2 has a sign in the westbound direction. Virginia Logos indicated that they couldn't identify a location that would be suitable for the eastbound direction coming toward downtown. You will see that there is a space at the upper right corner for 4 more businesses to be included in that sign. Right now, you only have the 7-Eleven and the Speedway gas station that are represented. And this is based on their inquiry to the state. And the state, sometimes they may, depending on what program they're running, reach out to the businesses, but they wait for the businesses to contact them. The next exit we have is exit 3, which is Victory Boulevard. That's down at your left-hand corner. There is one sign in each direction at Victory Boulevard. There is no space for an additional structure, and the only option left right now is for an additional gas station. And so you can see from here that there are more businesses around the Victory Boulevard area that could be represented, but because of the space required for these signs, these were the first 4 who were interested, and they got the positions on the sign. And that's on both sides of 260.
That's the Children's Museum under attraction?
We will get to that one, but yes, it is the
I
Children's
just can't see
Museum.
it that well.
All right. All right. Exit 4 is Portsmouth Boulevard, and we currently don't have any signs for Portsmouth Boulevard. They indicated that they could put a sign on the westbound side, but all the businesses that you would reach off of Portsmouth Boulevard, you really could get to them off of Victory Boulevard. That's the more direct route. Exit 5 is Frederick Boulevard. We don't have a sign here, but that is our midtown section of Portsmouth. And unfortunately, we do not have signs in either direction for Exit 5. There is not a suitable space to input a sign there, but they already have businesses on a wait list for if a space were able to become available. And however, we are continuing discussions with VDOT to develop a location for signage at Exit 5, which is Frederick Boulevard.
Mayor, one of the things, as I said to Mr. Jones, and this, he's been talking with VDOT, and their position has been, they haven't been able to find a space over the years off of Frederick Boulevard. Well, that's where all of our new eateries and TJ Maxx and everything is. And so when you come off, as we were describing today, there is a, I guess it's a ditch, but it falls off over here. So we were saying, well, maybe something concrete needs to be there. The sign up on top, at least get signs up, because right now, over the years, there has never, ever, and the state's position is there is nowhere to put it. But we are now going to go forward and say, we're going to find, we think you can put it here, and what you need to do to get it there. The construction may have to be different than flat land and just 2 poles to get it up there, because that's a very busy corridor. IHOP, Chick-fil-A, TJ Maxx, Kroger,
Wendy's, yeah,
and 4 companies have applications, but they're holding it because they said there is nowhere to put the sign. So we'll definitely be getting back with you on that one.
Okay, thank you. All right. The next exit is Exit 7. Before that, we have the exit to MLK. But Exit 7 is Effingham Street. There is a sign installed there in the eastbound direction, which is what you see on the right hand at the bottom there. A site could not be identified for the westbound side because you're coming out of the tunnel. There's a lot of concrete there. But you will notice the point that Ms. Simmons made is the national logo signs they're boldly colored. You can easily and readily identify them. Our Children's Museum is also included, and we are going to take a look at some options where we can sort of improve the attractiveness of that sign to match what's there.
But we pay $1,000 a year.
Yes.
For that sign.
Yes. Next, we have the Supplemental Guide Signs program. These are the brown signs that you see highlighting cultural attractions or tourist activities. And this is a rendering that we have received with the Virginia Logos proposal. This sign highlights the Old Town Historic District. So this is just a rendering, and the city would identify actual language if we were to move forward with this project.
Where is Exit 9B?
Exit, that's just a rendering. Yeah.
Not a fork.
Right.
Would be the 7B.
Yeah.
Why do they have to be brown?
This is a supplemental program, so their guide signs are green or blue, and because this is an additional program, they try to make sure that there's a differentiation between the different programs, and brown is just the color that they chose for
Like
these sorts of
MacArthur
attractions.
Mall's sign is
They
brown.
mean, they mean
The state.
VDOT?
Yes. And actually it brings up a good point where Ms. Simmons looked at the Children's Museum sign. So the Children's Museum sign would qualify for one of these brown signs, but because they're on the blue sign, they can't be on 2 programs.
Pick one or the other.
Exactly.
Is there a cost for the brown sign?
There is
Yes.
definitely a cost for the
Yes.
brown signs.
Don't get to that.
So coming up, we'll get to our cost, but just briefly, we'll look at the criteria. VDOT approves the signs. There is a limit of 2 supplemental guide signs at each exit. 2 structures is the maximum. The signs must be 800 feet apart, and you're looking at a total of 1,600 feet for both of those brown signs that you saw. And there's an application cost that covers the cost to qualify the location, design the signs, get approval from VDOT, and fabricate and install the signs. And so that's typically going to be in the range of $20,000 to $30,000 per sign. And so we'll look at the total impact. If we were to move forward with this program, this is the impact. Old Town Historic district does qualify. We are located within the correct distance from I-664, 464, along 264, and State Route 164. So we meet the requirement for distance. On I-664, there would be 4 signs, and that's estimated to cost $46,000. And so the sign costs are, on each side of I-64, there is what's called a main line sign. It could be overhead or it could be beside the highway. Each one of those main signs costs $15,000. And then there is a ramp sign for exit, that's actually exit 9 on 664. The exit 9, those signs are $7,500 a piece in each direction. So that's how you get 15 times 2 is 30,000. 7,500 times 2 is 15, and gets you up to 45. And then $1,000 is because there's an application fee of $250 for each new sign.
State's cleaning up.
Yes.
Yeah, question. On these, now, is there an annual cost with these as it is for the blue signs, or is this a one-time cost?
There is an annual maintenance cost for these also.
You know that cost?
I will check to be sure. I don't want to give it to you in error, but I'll follow up with you on the annual cost for that. So those are the costs for I-664, 464, 264. There is, and people may not notice, but on I-464, there is a sign in the median. It's brown, and it currently says Harbor Center Pavilion. And so this proposal would replace that with the Historic District sign. The same goes for 264. There are signs currently that say Harbor Center Pavilion. Those would be replaced with Historic District signs in this proposal.
When you say replaced, do you mean that they're going to say Old Town Historic District
You could say two
and then
things.
Union Bank and Trust Pavilion or Harbor Pavilion?
Right, it would
all
stay.
in one
You
thing?
could put two things on one.
Right, so we would check on that. They said that you can have at least 2 messages on one sign. So if we don't have to replace them, we would have both there. But there's a possibility we would have to have one at the expense of the other.
Do you know if VDOT does this in-house or contracted out?
Well, so Virginia Logos actually runs the whole program. So they're responsible for getting the signs fabricated, designed, installed, engineered at a cost savings for the state.
So like on the slide 2, where the 2B sign has the room for 4 more spots, I mean, do they just go up there and screen print it on there, or do they take the whole sign down and put up a new sign?
So they look like they are made together, but they are actually individual signs that are on the blue background. Right.
Can you fabricate your own sign to their specs?
Yes, you can. We checked on that as a cost savings. Our sign shop is set up to do traffic signs and street signs, and so these signs are larger than our normal capability. If we had to do something like this, we would contract that out as well. All right. And that brings me to the end of my presentation, but you can see what the total cost would be if we were to move forward with the program.
Just to refresh everybody's memory, remember we were approached by the Old Town Business Association about helping them get signs for the business district. And so it's more complicated than just asking VDOT to put the sign up.
Yeah.
It's
I
gonna
mean, if
be-
we're serious about history and tourism, that's what you do.
We need them.
Yeah.
We need them.
I just said that to put it in context. I'm not-
Especially with the hit we're taking on the tolling of the tunnel. I think we have to do something proactive to try to attract more tourism.
Do we want to give the city manager any direction?
Yes, do it.
Yes, they'll come back with a finalized cost and whatever the annual maintenance fee
Right, we
is,
can
so
do
we
that.
have that in mind.
And we'll move expeditiously on that.
Majority of council?
Yes. Only question, thinking about, in the future, what we've, been discussing in the presentation on the Crawford Gateway, to have that into thought too, if you can put more than one message on the sign, is how does that happen in the future? If we went ahead with the program and put Old Town Historical District, could we revisit it and add that verbiage to it, or would that be allowed on that sign, you know, because it's really down in the same area. We want to pull them into the same area.
Well, I'm sorry. I think that was the idea behind the Old Town Historic District, is that it may not draw you directly to the historic district, but to downtown in general.
Yeah, sure.
And that's the catch for the phrasing.
All right. Everybody good?
Thank you.
Thank you all. All right, Mayor and members of council, now our city attorney, Mr. Ashby, will come forward, bringing back to you the issues as it relates to requirements for insurance for Civic League-sponsored activities, and he will move into the discussion of the Historic Preservation Commission hearings tomorrow night.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council. Tonight, as Dr. Patton has mentioned, we return to the issue of parades and demonstrations in order to address City Council's inquiry regarding insurance requirements for civic associations and neighborhood block parties and events. Since you all tasked us with that responsibility, I, along with the city manager's staff, with the assistance of Deputy City Manager Vincent Jones, have conducted a survey of the cities, localities in the area, what those requirements are, and tonight we will take you through the survey results as we present how other cities are addressing issues with regard to civic leagues and insurance requirements in terms of events. And we'll also discuss how Portsmouth compares with those. Let's first start with Chesapeake. As you'll see from this slide, Chesapeake requires a permit for events held on public property. They require the permittee or the person holding the permit to pay premiums and fees associated with insurance. In the city of Chesapeake, the insurance limit requirement is $1 million, or it can be adjusted by the risk manager if there are additional risks involved. In the city of Chesapeake, the city is required to be listed as an insured party. Therefore, if there is any kind of a loss, the city is not simply the person who receives proof of the fact that there's insurance by a permit applicant. They're also insured in the process. And in Chesapeake, civic leagues are required to comply with this requirement. In Newport News, as you can imagine, every city is a little different. In Newport News, there's also an insurance requirement. Their insurance limits are a little different, $500,000 for bodily injury and $50,000 for property damage. Again, the city of Newport News requires that they be listed as an insured party, and they do require the civic leagues to obtain the insurance. When we get to the city of Norfolk, you will see that they have a much more extensive program. The city of Norfolk requires, when there's an event on public property, they require general liability insurance, workers' compensation insurance, auto liability insurance, errors and omissions insurance, privacy and breach of information insurance, fidelity and faithful performance insurance. Now, let me go through that in a little bit as we talk about what those are. When we talk about fidelity and faithful performance, we're talking about what we typically call a surety bond. Many times we put those in place both to make sure whatever the activity actually occurs, but also if there's some sort of loss in the midst of that project, if there's a theft or something by a contractor or some other employee. Errors and omissions is generally an insurance you require for directors and officers of a particular company or corporation. Privacy and breach of information, I think that's pretty forward thinking as we are all dealing with cybersecurity issues, but that covers that element of it. You'll see the insurance limits that Norfolk requires as it relates to the commercial general liability, the E&O insurance, the privacy insurance, and the auto bodily injury insurance, they require a $1 million limit and generally $2 million per occurrence, meaning if there's an incident, the maximum that they will pay out is $2 million. As it relates to workers' compensation, they require $500,000. In terms of the insurance limit, the $100,000 is required for property damage related to auto losses, and the $100,000 limit also applies to fidelity or surety bond. And as with other cities, the city of Norfolk is an insured party, and they do impose these requirements on civic leagues. Suffolk is a slightly different than some of the other cities. They require the execution of a release to release the city from any liability. They also request a indemnification clause to be signed also. They do have insurance limits. Again, they have a $1 million commercial general liability insurance. They also require a $1 million excess umbrella policy. They have a $1 million auto liability requirement and a $100,000 worker compensation requirement. The city of Suffolk is both the certificate holder. They require themselves to be both the certificate holder and the insured party. That meaning if somebody applies for an event, they have to make sure that the city gets a copy of their certificate of insurance as well as names the city as a insured party. Civic leagues are required to comply with these requirements. The exception is National Night Out.
Solomon, generally speaking, how enforceable is the release and waiver?
Mayor, I would tell you that I rely on the insurance as opposed to the release. The issue is if any locality were to simply rely on the release, you then have to find out if the entity is viable enough to survive whatever the claim or the loss might be. So a release alone is probably not that helpful. What the releases do is it puts you in the driver position in terms of trying to assemble those entities and making them first in line in terms of defending whatever issue may occur or the loss. Whether or not they're absolute, it's always up for debate and for litigation. So the insurance policy is probably the best gold standard. In the city of Virginia Beach, their rules are, again, slightly different as each city has some different elements to it. They do require their permit applicants to register for insurance. If the applicant does not have insurance, they make it plain that they may in fact acquire insurance on their behalf, or they can purchase it through the city. City of Virginia Beach also requests that the permit applicant sign a hold harmless clause. Again, that's in the same vein of the releases and whatnot. But their insurance limit is simply a $1 million commercial general liability insurance requirement. The city of Virginia Beach does not require one to place them as an additional insured on a policy. They just simply want notice, and so they just simply require that they be the insurance holder, that they get notification that there is insurance in place. As it relates to civic leagues, Virginia Beach does require the insurance, but they do waive some rental fees. Now we come to Portsmouth. Portsmouth does require its permit applicants to purchase insurance. They may be required to purchase the insurance through the city auspices. In some of our applications, we do also have a hold harmless clause. But as you'll see, Portsmouth is probably on the low end in terms of requirements. We just have a simple $1 million commercial general liability insurance requirement. We do ask that the city of Portsmouth be listed as an insured party. We also provide the exception to civic leagues for National Night Out. In some instances, if there's a need to purchase insurance, the risk manager generally assists individuals and finding that event insurance is generally a couple of $100s in terms of expense.
Does it make any difference whether or not food is being served as to whether or not insurance is required?
From the city standpoint?
Yes.
No, we don't make that distinction in terms of our application. You may have additional requirements, health licenses and those sorts of things, but we don't make a insurance requirement specific to food.
Is that required of vendors that participate in a city function?
Is the insurance required? No, let me explain. If it is a city function, then the overall arching insurance for the city is the city's participation. So we are self-insured. So when we talk about city events, we have a certain level of insurance. What do we require of the vendors who are participating? They must have the appropriate permits required by the Commissioner of Revenue, and if it's a food truck, by zoning. I'm not sure.
Health Department.
And the Health Department. I'm not sure what that requires as we sit here in terms of insurance from them, but they have to meet the requirements to perform their duties. So I would assume that would have some level of insurance, but I don't know that we check insurance for vendors.
Right.
The one thing too that's allowed, we've done it before, big large vendors like special events who do all kinds of things, cater, rent equipment, you can actually work under their insurance and their coverage and, without no cost. But they have to send a certificate of their proof of insurance to the city. The city signs off. We've done that a couple of times, and we were covered under special events insurance where we didn't have to pay the cost of it, and that included, the food. We actually hired them for the food and chairs and tents and tables, and then they told us that that's how we learned that they could cover us too. So, and the city has accepted that on a couple of occasions.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Attorney, the issue that I saw with some of the other cities as far as having a risk manager that could adjust the limits based on the exposure to risk, is that something that the city considers, or is just a flat $1 million for each applicant?
I don't know that in recent history we've ever adjusted up. The kinds of things you typically have those adjustments for instance, if you're going to have fireworks, typically you're going to have a whole lot more insurance requirement around an event that may be associated with fireworks. Other than that, I don't know of a situation that really would require that number to go up. Potentially, it would have to be some sort of hazard, unusual hazard that would raise concern. And when you're talking about city events, you're probably talking about fireworks. That's probably the typical scenario.
So the situation we discussed earlier about trying to limit some groups as far as parade permits, and there was some First Amendment issues with that. Would this be a route for groups that have a history of having some type of violent or causing issues with the public? Could that be a route of increasing insurance coverage?
The most likely situation you would have is if you have some sort of repetitive behavior by the same individual. It is difficult to say if you don't have the same person involved and it's a repeat. That would be fairly difficult to try to impose that. What the law says is it's very, it does not take a position if you're going after someone after an event has occurred. putting up impediments prior to an actual activity that brings some sort of loss becomes a little bit more difficult. You probably do have some latitude if there's a repeat offender. You could have a little more latitude in terms of trying to assess that risk in that situation. You'll probably also see other things in terms of, like the insurance, whether or not they can in fact get insurance. If you have someone who's been associated with some sort of loss, they're going to have a more difficult time in terms of obtaining insurance of any kind.
So is that a flexibility that the city should have, and if so, is that an ordinance issue, changing our ordinance, or is that a charter issue or what?
No, it is a under the current ordinance and under the applications that we have and the rates and the other issues that we're resolving in terms of updating, those will be what I would call on-call situations as opposed to requiring any additional ordinance changes in advance. Some of those issues will be assessments that will be made in proximity to whenever that event will occur. But that's the normal process.
So based on that, then Portsmouth has the flexibility, if need be, to adjust that insurance limit without it being an act of council or anything?
If the city wants to extend its insurance or require its insurance to be higher than the $1 million, we certainly can do as Virginia Beach does, set out certain factors and then have that adjustment made. Or for that matter, again, we talk about time, place, and manner restrictions on First Amendment. Those just have to be reasonable and have to have a standard in advance to suggest what that issue is.
But it wouldn't have to come through council to do that?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
Are you saying then that administratively the limit could be changed from 1 to 2?
If there was an issue and we have a rate and a standard and a policy in place in advance, and it is not content related, certainly we can change that insurance limit.
Right now, do we?
Excuse me.
Go ahead. I think we have a little bit of confusion here.
Yes.
The issue is the way I see it, is the $1 million limit established by ordinance or by some administrative policy?
It's in the application process.
So it has not been established by ordinance?
It is not in the ordinance.
No, and that's what tonight's discussion is when he comes back with the ordinances.
This is good information.
Right.
Yes.
I would have assumed that it was ordinance.
Right.
No.
And I had a question, Mayor. One of the things that I said to Mr. Ashby is that as a result of your retreat and this discussion on the parades and demonstrations and the discussion of insurance coverage, this probably has not been discussed in the last 25 to 30 years. And so one of the questions I asked Mr. Ashby is, when we look at all of the parameters that are in place in other cities for protection, and we have now a strong risk management department, for him to, as a result of this discussion, he needs to tell us, or they need to tell us, he's got a team working with him, where we should be and what should we be doing. And definitely, he has said, and I read here, he's going to be coming back with this in ordinance form so that you all can vote, and we'll have this written. Right now, it's not in an ordinance form.
Well, I think that's, speaking for me, I think that's a good idea. I mean, what are you going to do if someone comes and challenges the very notion of the requirement for insurance and says, well, who gave you the authority to require me to have $1 million worth of insurance, or 1.5 or 2 million, or whatever the number is?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of council, let me give you the basis for the 1 million. First, the ordinance says you're required to have procure and maintain a policy of insurance as determined by the city manager or her designee. That is the
so there is
ordinance
language
language.
That kind of sets us the structure for this.
Correct. We don't set the limit.
Right.
We don't set the limit, and I would not necessarily advise setting the limit because, again, there are a number of factors. The governor as I'll refer to later in the presentation, the governor's task force on civil unreadiness, all those issues coming out of Charlottesville, they readily acknowledge, and we do across the state, that there are things you must consider with regard to each and every type of expressive activity you may have. The issue is you must set the standard in advance. You can't change it as the subject matter comes across the table. And so, but I would no more tell you to set the insurance limit necessarily today higher or lower. The $1 million is the standard insurance required statewide for any kind of procurement activity. That is the, quote, lowest amount that we require in terms of any kind of business with the city. And that comes out of the procurement law. So that's where the 1 million comes from.
So your recommendation back to council is going to have language in there with a standard that would allow for that insurance limit to be changed based on certain criteria?
Typically, that would be done when the application is filed. The policy levels and the considerations will be resolved by the staff as we go forward. Not necessarily, it won't be coming back to council because those will be staff decisions within planning. There will be some staff decisions within police, and then risk management as we sit here and refine those factors in advance to set essentially a sort of like a list, a checklist. Are these things in place? What are the issues? And then we have to resolve it. Because each one could potentially create more of a burden as opposed to assistance with a given subject matter. So your insurance policy, if $1 million insurance policy costs $200, that's fine. If $2 million of insurance in one shape or fashion costs $1,000, there may be some pushback as to whether or not that creates an impediment to First Amendment. So we're gonna flesh it all the way out from a staff level, not from an ordinance level.
Right.
There's also the factor that the city has, which they shouldn't do and wouldn't do, they can assume responsibility. And this is for outside group on activity, and it's not city. But they have the option of insuring it, or they say, well, you need insurance, then the city will go get it for them to that insurance company. And that insurance company requirements are based on attendance, on how many people you expect. So they have ranges that it goes up and down based on how many people you expect. And so if you expect 100,000 people, that insurance company is going to charge more than $1 million because that's who the city goes to. The city has to acquire an outside insurance company for this organization, or you can get it yourself. But even if you get it yourself, it's based on the people in attendance. And another factor is these insurance companies want to know who's going to be attending, what's the purpose of it, and they can deny any time. They are private in most of them. They can deny that insurance coverage, which can kill the event, which will take it off the city. So because that means they can't provide it. If they're coming in here, one of these groups that has a reputation, a bad reputation, come in, well, that'll probably be known if that kind of group comes in, and then it'll be based on how many people they expect and what they're going to be doing at the event, and where it's going to be. So, I mean, all that said, I'm just saying there are other factors that kind of protect the city against just anybody, any kind of group just throwing any kind of activity without some kind of parameters or cost.
Lisa.
I guess so that will bring us back to how Norfolk has theirs with the E&O, the errors and omissions. I mean, wouldn't that cover anything that would be left out?
I I wouldn't say that it would necessarily cover everything. It is very comprehensive, and what I would say is that the type of insurance that Norfolk requires probably covers every scenario under the sun. But it is probably excessive for your garden variety, city-sponsored parade or private parade. It covers everything. It covers a festival, a week-long concert, or any of a number of things. So I think they're the gold standard. I think they've got everything covered in their ordinance, bottom line. What Portsmouth has in place, I think, is probably appropriately sized for the standard special events you would have for private or public entities. Again, when the city's involved, we are the insured party, and more often than not. But I think our limits are understandable in most cases at $1 million. But again, if you have a situation, if it becomes an issue of insurance, those are the things that are going to be discussed with risk management and the city staff to see if we have an issue and whether or not that project can go forward under the auspices of the application and the laws we have in place.
And it's really a case by case.
It is.
You can't make an ordinance to cover everything. It's a case by case and event by event. You have to deal with it under the circumstances and what the requirements are.
And as Councilman Smith said, there are considerations an insurance company can have that would be problematic for us. But if they decide not to insure, then that's certainly a factor we have to take into consideration. So they may have some latitudes, some considerations that we will not have, and then we have to balance those. The other thing I will say is, as it relates to cost, there is a requirement under First Amendment law that there must be some set of criteria for indigent people to still be able to exercise their rights. So while we're talking about these requirements as requirements, we will also be putting into place a mechanism of assessing whether or not each and every person that comes in claiming indigency, and so we want to waive fees and cost, we'll have to have an established process of evaluating that, and we'll have to stick to that very closely. With that, let me just, I won't take you through all of these slides that you have seen in prior presentations. They cover many of the things we've talked about before in terms of how these ordinances will apply. I'll just highlight a couple of points. In our revisions, we're still requesting that applicants try to meet the 30-day requirement if they can for any kind of intensive activity in terms of putting us on notice or filing their application 30 days in advance. When there's a less intensive activity, we've talked with staff. We're now asking for 10 business days as being the outside limit in terms of applying for less intensive activities. We will try our best to respond. If everything is available, we will try to respond in 15 business days for the major events. We'll try to respond in 5 business days for the less intensive events if everything is submitted in a timely fashion to the city. Again, as I said to you before, the city manager will certainly be addressing denials both of applications, the alteration of locations, whether or not fees will be waived or not. All of those issues have to be addressed in a content-neutral fashion. We talked a little earlier about those city ordinances that apply to any type of demonstration that may not have a permit, that otherwise creates some sort of impediment in terms of traffic or some issue of safety. And so I won't go through those. But let me tell you where we are in terms of staff. Staff has identified a number of city properties. We are rating those for size and safety in accordance with some of the guidelines set forth by the Governor's Task Force on Public Safety Preparedness and the response to civil unrest. On the 24th, we will bring back to you the ordinance with all the revisions. We will also bring back to you a proposed council rule on signage for the city council chambers, and that will essentially be a 3-by-4 foot sign without any type of support structure that can be held in the back of the council chambers. And we are offering up the suggestion that there be no signage in this particular room because it's very tight anyway as we sit, and will block views and that sort of thing.
3x4 is pretty big.
Yeah.
Well, that is typically what you all have at the podium for.
Is that what a poster board is?
Right, that's what the poster board piece is. And so if you're presenting, you'll have the opportunity to do as everyone has done at the podium. If you want to hold something that size, it has to be at the back of the room so that everyone can see, and we don't have any issues about ingress and egress in the council chambers. Any further questions on that?
Yeah. How about if somebody brings a sign in that says "Eat at Joe's" in the back? That's
They
3x4.
can see it. They can bring it.
It's got to be content neutral.
Well, it's got to be. It's content neutral, and I will tell you that since Town versus Greece, all of the issues have surrounded. All of these First Amendment issues are surrounding content, and so if you can have one in protest of one other matter, Eat at Joe's is
Exactly.
it's an issue. I mean, we can't necessarily preclude it because we consider it personal advertising.
Yeah.
The law says they can do it.
No.
Say again.
We've been talking about the new laws, which Mr. Asher and I talked about today. It's content neutral, so we could not say, you got to take your sign out because it says Eat at Joe's.
Now, but our rules do preclude saying bad things about another person.
Joe's, you can't say
Right,
Joe's.
yeah,
You can't say what? Eat Joe's.
Bump his head.
yeah.
What, Mr. Anthony?
You know, you can't have a sign, our rules preclude you from speaking.
But your
You can't
sign.
go to the podium and say Mayor Rose an idiot.
No, you can't.
Well, you say that, the rules prohibit that.
The rules prohibit that.
But it's done. The same way with advertising from the podium. We've had people actually do an info commercial from the podium within that 5-minute time frame. So
Yeah,
it does happen.
I get the content, content neutral, but what if somebody comes in with a sign that's got a bunch of profanity on it? I still get it's neutral, but at some point, there's got to be something for that case.
Well,
The,
just I think about 6 months ago, you remember you called to my attention a sign on a business that you all thought was kind of offensive, but getting with legal and with planning, they let it be known, it's my business. I can put on my sign on my business, whatever I choose to do with the new federal laws. So we left it alone.
and I will tell you, council members, the issue is not the comment. The issue is the conducting of the city's business. So as with any sort of judgment call, you are always balancing First Amendment rights, the form that you're in, the fact that the person may be discussing issues of public concern, and in the process they may use some colorful language in the process, but it is a tension that will always have to be balanced out, as Mr. Smith said, at the time, given the situation and what the parameters are. But to say outright, my sign has X, Y, and Z on it, we're clearly beyond that point that we can stop a sign based on what's written on it. Mr. Baldwin, we've had this discussion with regard to the signage ordinances that we're moving through planning, where it is the same principle across all forms of First Amendment language. So it really is content and conduct is the issue. It's the conduct.
Well, the FCC prohibits certain language. Matter of fact, I think all the networks bleep out
They tried to bleep out.
certain words. So,
Especially if it's going to be televised.
yeah.
Well, they tried to.
Yeah.
You've been heard some terrible language recently.
So I don't understand why we would have to allow a sign with the same type of language that would be televised when the verbal language can be bleeped out.
I will tell you, Councilman Moody, that I can provide you probably in the neighborhood of 60-some references to cases, some of which in fact include profanity. Sometimes the profanity and the conduct, the city was supported in its decision to remove someone or ask them to leave a podium, and then there are some where you jump a little early and the city may have lost that particular scenario. So it is a thin line that we try to sort of navigate in that context, because there again, some of us may have a little blue language in our language, and so if you have one word, you know, I think it was Carlin that had the 7 words you couldn't say on TV, and that's the long-running joke. What I would probably say is more like the dog bite. You probably can get away with it the first time. You continue to do it, or it becomes a belligerent exchange. There is more latitude in terms of what government can do.
Other questions, comments?
Well, I mean, I'm just curious about, you know, the signs. I mean, you know, they had availability to use PowerPoint. If somebody's giving us a presentation, do we need signs at all? If it's going to be free for all, that you can have people coming in with 20 different signs saying whatever, do we need any signs in the council chambers? Because we do.
I think it's saying that folks have a right. That's a public place to bring them. Isn't that what you were saying?
You have certain rules. Let me give you a couple of scenarios, just for instance. The council chamber is not what we would call a traditional forum like the street or the sidewalk. So it is not as wide open as someone who wants to do something on a street corner. However, when you establish rules, again, under the current, most recent Supreme Court cases, they have to be content neutral. So you can have a opportunity for expression, which council does provide the citizens, but you then cannot pick and choose necessarily the manner. You can shape the time, the manner, the place. And so as it relates to signs, at one point in time we talked about buttons, some of those things, T-shirts, those sorts of things. You are subjecting yourselves to the potential of getting a challenge if you try to move forward and not provide some space, limited though it may be, for certain types of expression. But I understand what Councilman Clark is talking about. We allow signs for EDA planning presentations. If someone wanted to express themselves by sign or of that sort, then your issues are what kind of issues are raised by the particular manner of expression. And so that's why the suggestion is signs, if they're going to be there, they're at the back. And let me add this one other piece. The city has had what I would call practices as it relates to the council chamber for years. The reason you're seeing this now is because I would not want the city to be in a position of enforcing its practices without it putting it in writing in some places. So either you decide it now, or you may not be able to decide it on that particular night if there's an issue.
Back to the point, you know, if that's the part of the ordinance we're looking at, that it's going to prohibit signs in the conference room in here, then we could do the same thing in the council chambers.
You could.
I mean, the only reason I say that is, you know, I know some people bring them displays, but usually when there's a display, they have the PowerPoint. Because I know from where I sit at, I can't see what's on their display. So the PowerPoint is really where the information is coming from, or they give us handouts. So, you know, to me, it's almost easier to not open that door for everybody to just show up with a bunch of crazy signs, since they can't be controlled.
that is an issue for you all's consideration.
But the door is open, and he's talking about closing the door.
But again, the council chambers, one of the things I think is difficult for folks to wrap their minds around is the fact that city council, although it is representative government, the opportunity, there's a requirement to attend. Public must be allowed to attend the meeting to see the workings of government. However, the ability to speak to government during that process is not as wide open as some folks would think. It has to be productive. And so you do have some control over the productivity of that process.
When you bring this on the 24th, this will be not for action.
No,
it will be for discussion.
I will bring the parade ordinance. This will be your first chance to see proposed language on council rules and chambers.
I thought I knew the answer. I said that because this will give us a chance to get into the philosophical questions that each one member of council has.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other comments, direction?
And now, Mayor, we'll go to the HPC, Historical Preservation Commission process.
We have 2 hearings tomorrow in lieu of the work session. So we'll report to the council chamber, right, Deborah?
Yes, sir.
I'll open the meeting, call the roll, and you'll come up with the process.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of council, Code of Virginia Section 15.2-2306 provides that a governing body may establish what we call a historic district, and if it does so, it must provide, it can also enact an ordinance, as the city of Portsmouth has done, that requires no building or structure, including signs, shall be erected or reconstructed unless they essentially are compatible with the historic district. Tomorrow, you all will be asked to sit as an appellate body over a application wherein the question before you is going to be whether or not the HPC was in error in finding that the proposed actions would not be compatible with the historic district. The process we have here in the city of Portsmouth is an individual can apply to make certain modifications to their property in the historic district. Those issues are reviewed by city staff. They ultimately may be brought before the HPC for review. If the HPC denies any aspect of that application, the city does take a look at the process, and as the HPC decided what will occur, or in some respects determine whether or not they agree that there's some sort of error, and then that matter is appealed to the city council. The city council will review the matter de novo, and you all should have access to the record that was before the HPC. If you do not, if you agree with the denial and the applicant chooses to move forward, they also have the opportunity to appeal to city council if they don't necessarily agree with your decision. Circuit Court, what did I say?
City Council.
City Council.
Circuit Court, you're right. Excuse me. The process for tomorrow will involve 10 minutes for the applicant, because it is the applicants that are appealing, so they will have up to 10 minutes to present their case. The HPC Commission Chair will have 10 minutes to present the Commission's position. We also allot 10 minutes for you all to deliberate. So each case has up to about 30 minutes in terms of the time you have for resolution. You will have the opportunity, of course, to discuss the matter. If you choose to deliberate, you could deliberate at the dais in the council chambers. You all could retreat here if you so choose. If you have any questions of council, there's also the opportunity to go into closed session if you have an issue or you so choose. So,
Deborah, you'll keep the time?
Yes, sir.
the only other thing I will mention to council is as you consider these matters, as I said before, the HPC is obligated to approve an application if the proposed action would not be a substantially adverse effect on the aesthetics, the culture, the historical, or the architectural significance of the district. And so you, as well as the Historic Preservation Commission, are considering the historic character of the property and making sure that that's retained. Typically, the balance is towards repairing and not replacing any items that have architectural significance. And of course, the overarching guideline is to make sure that these applications and these revisions or construction is done in a way that's compatible with the guidelines that you as city council members have set forth. You all will recall the last time, I believe this was early January, we had a situation with the church. And I just simply mention that because many times we'll have some discussion of undue hardship. Undue hardship is not necessarily what you may call in layman terms a financial hardship, but that can tend to come up rather frequently. But I just wanted to make you aware of those, what I would call the broad considerations that come up when we have these sort of applications and appeals. Any questions?
So just on that last part about the undue hardship, when you say unless the property's value is destroyed, is that if the say replacement occurs or if it does not? Which direction is it that determines whether?
Typically, when we're talking about undue hardships, we're talking about whether or not for instance, I have to give you a different context, whether or not it would require you to, whether or not the correction would require a destruction of the property. So for instance, when we talk about financial considerations are not hardships, if it costs you money to make the corrections or to comply with the HPC, you can't simply value the dollar amount. The issue would be if in order to, let's say, in order to comply with a particular requirement, you would have to saw off a back of a house or remove a roof or a second story or something that's major in terms of damaging, and it was not a situation that you created, but the rules required the destruction of the property value. That is an undue hardship. The rules require the destruction of value. Many times you'll see situations where somebody did something and it may be something the applicant did or someone else did that may affect the value, but those aren't really the financial considerations we're talking about or undue hardship. It's when the rules impose a loss on value.
So I think in the past there have been cases such as replacing something with the actual slate versus some lesser cost material. If that lesser cost material maintains the value, then that wouldn't be in violation of that financial hardship issue.
Probably the reverse is true. The value you're talking about, we're talking about financial value versus the standard. If the standard is slate, your obligation is to stay with the standard. If there's a financial, if there was something about the process of replacing slate that would cause you to lose the house or lose the second floor or whatever, then that might be an undue hardship. But the assessment is not replacing slate with architectural because it preserves the value. That is not the way it's assessed.
Okay.
Other questions? Right.
A few of you might remember Elizabeth and Bill. We went all the way to federal court in a Port Norfolk situation, and the judge sent it to arbitration. And I think eventually the person just kind of withdrew, but they did, something they weren't supposed to do against the roof. Bob may remember it too. I don't know. You remember in Port Norfolk? I don't remember. I do remember the person. I do remember where it was, and I remember we were in federal court because it went through from council to circuit court, then it went to federal court, then the federal judge sent it to arbitration. And that, because it was taking lengthy time to go through that process, the person eventually withdrew and they sold the property. So, and it was just kind of dropped. But there's a possibility that it could go.
I don't remember what happened with the roof, but I know what you're talking about.
Port Norfolk.
Well, a few times, I think the last time we had an issue come to council, we had asked for an updated list of acceptable items that are facsimiles, like you mentioned, real slate. Real slate is extremement expensive, and I'm not certain that doesn't fall under hardship. In fact, I think council at that time approved the facsimile instead of the real slate. And that conversation led to, well, let's get an updated list of similar materials that doesn't affect the aesthetics of the property, but allows the homeowner to make improvements and still keep with the integrity of the appearance.
And I'll let Mr. Baldwin, I think we did deal with the slate roofs issue, council.
And I think that was your point. Before you speak, if the house is worth $100,000, okay, but it takes $120 to replace the slate roof, why isn't that a financial hardship?
The term is not financial hardship, Mayor.
Why isn't that an undue hardship? That's both a direct question and a rhetorical question.
Okay. Well, let me just, good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor Simmons, members of council. Let me just speak to the slate roof question, because that tends to be the most expensive thing. And if you happen to look on our webpage, you'll see we actually studied that question in 2015 at the request of the HPC, because they felt like they did not have enough flexibility in the design guidelines that were adopted around 2010 to offer alternatives to using slate. We did a survey. We hired actually an architecture firm to do the review. Now the HPC does have alternatives they can look at. Instead of just saying, sorry, it's slate or it's slate, they do have options to go to a synthetic slate. They even have the option to go to shingles in certain situations, and they've done that. So it's one of the reasons you've stopped seeing slate roof questions, because that exact question council put forth was taken care of. Right.
So it's part of the policy now.
It's exactly. It's part of it's actually revised design guidelines for the HPC. Now that doesn't mean they may tell somebody, I'm sorry, in your case we think you need to stick with the slate, right, and they may appeal that. Just want to let you know that the HPC does have the authority and the flexibility in their design guidance to apply and approve an alternative should they so desire.
So back in 2015, I think there was a little anxiety with the HPC because it was not within the policy, but council did approve it because right, we felt, okay. So it's not an issue. Yeah. Okay.
The question I have is, like, you got new construction, because I know there was one or two houses being put in the 300 block of Maryland Avenue, I believe, like 301, 303. So what kind of guidelines does new construction have to meet when they're going in a historical neighborhood?
Well, each neighborhood has its own set of design guidelines, and there are design standards for new construction as opposed to preserving original construction. So there's a set of guidelines for new. And that does talk about using materials such as hardy plank instead of wood siding, things of that nature. So there's quite a bit of difference in new construction versus historic, primarily trying to get something that's compatible with what's around it, not harmful to the existing historic district.
I think Bill's got a question.
Well, it might be good if we would see a list of the changes that they've been approved, like the roof. I think there was some window materials.
Right, and what you do see is the use of composite windows. That was another issue.
Right.
That's also allowed using composite as opposed to requiring wood windows or repairing existing. There's some flexibility. When the design guidelines were updated back in 2010, you may recall, for those people who were around before that, we had really high, the same design standards were being applied in Old Town were being applied in Craddock and in Truxton. And that seemed to be quite a bit of difference between these neighborhoods. And so now each set of design guidelines is customized for each neighborhood, taking into consideration, quite frankly, the ability to pay and what are the materials that are critical to each neighborhood as far as from a historic preservation standpoint. So
Are they on our
each
website?
district's different.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Planning Department webpage is all the design guidelines, and that mentioned that roof study is on there as well.
That was quite a discussion back then because some of the older neighborhoods like Craddock had new families moving in, and they were being faced with trying to replace a slate roof and cord windows and a whole list of things. And it was either, from the city standpoint, it was either do you want the house to fall apart, deteriorate, or do you want it to be repaired and still have a good appearance?
And you may recall that same time there was actually a discussion of would neighborhoods want to come out of historic district designation entirely to free themselves from those standards. And ultimately the neighborhoods decided they did not want to come out. They liked the historic designation. So there's a certain amount of requirement that goes with it. Yes, exactly.
Grace, got a question?
Yeah, because even further back, and you can answer this too, and I'm curious, because you heard different conflicting things as far as reviews from these commissioners and then from the neighborhoods. If y'all remember, there used to be a separate commission for each district, and we went away from that because they were all inconsistent. There was some hardcore, there was some that weren't real flexible, and they actually were rude to some of the persons that were coming there. So we went to this one commission concept, and I think that eliminated that. But how's that working?
It's working very well. Exactly. We had Commission of Architecture Review 1 and 2. That's why they were broken up. And in fact, that original thing I described there with the Old Town, Craddock, and Truxton was 1, and then you had Parkview, Port Norfolk were in the other. And yes, I think that was a constant complaint. I know back when I was working before the design guidelines were updated, there was a lot of questions about the inconsistencies between the two cars. Some people believe it was not simply representative of the different kinds of neighborhoods, it's just the personalities. Bearing in mind you've got citizen volunteers performing this function for you, and so there was some concern being raised. I'm sure council heard that as well. I would say I think our single HPC, they get the broad view, and I think with the revised design guidelines, and I will say we are looking probably within probably next year, not this current fiscal year, and the next year probably looking to update the design guidelines again, because the new ones will hit that 10-year-old. I call them new, but they're almost 10 years old now. So we will go back and look and take another complete, fresh look at the design guidelines.
Good. All right.
Yeah.
Right.
If you recall, I was a liaison.
I was going to say, that was your work.
Yeah, and I attended a lot of these meetings, and some of those folks had been on there too long, and they were like King Tut.
They were historic.
They were hard, and they were rude, and I sat there in the meeting, and it didn't faze them at all.
Thanks, Mr. Bowles.
So, and that was a big problem that was eliminated.
Thank you. Any other questions for Solomon?
And as I said, Mayor, you all have the materials available to you that will be part of your consideration for tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
I'll say one more thing.
Yes, sir.
We have to, there's a lot of homework that has to be done to look at all of those guidelines. We have to depend on staff like we do in any other situation to determine, you know, was there something unusual? Was there something that didn't happen that should have? And they should be the, you know, the ones that's kind of directing and advising us, because they're at the process too. They have staff members at the meetings, and because we can't in this short time look at all these guidelines and look at all the materials and things like that and make a determination. We just got to rely on their recommendation. Was the process followed and was it fair? And
5:30, what he's saying.
Yes, sir.
The materials, they're in the box.
Yes, sir.
What is it? What's the
It's under
reference?
tomorrow's
Agenda information, under tomorrow
public work
presentation?
session.
Okay.
It should be linked. If not, it's under, I would have to take a look.
Oh, yeah, I see it. Yep.
You see it?
You need to review it tomorrow before
I was going to say, I know we have it.
I said, Mayor and members of council, based on what Mr. Smith said, we were planning to start the hearing exactly at 5. Is there a need at 5 to have some kind of quick review for you all of it before you go in to start?
Let's give 15-minute review.
yeah,
I think it'd be
I
good.
think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
All right.
15-minute review.
So it will start here, we don't have a 1 hour. It will start here at 5 and have a 15-minute review, and then they move to the chambers for the hearings.
This
Or
question.
we could do it out there.
So you can do it out there.
Yeah.
This is a question for council on that. Since it's a review, should management be advising us, or should we hear from this de novo person?
You have, to the extent that council needs, much like any deliberative body, if you have a need to review the matters in advance as an appellate body, you certainly have that opportunity. Of course, you're going to have materials. You've got some materials with you now. You have an applicant that's going to present their case. You're going to have the HPC chair present the decision below and what the positions are. But certainly, if there is some level of information you need in advance, certainly let us know, and then we can provide whatever that information may be.
That's a good question, good answer. I took your question to be more generic and not relating to the two cases.
Yeah, just generic.
That
That's
it
what I
would be a
was thinking.
review of what has been changed in the way of what's acceptable, like
But
no longer is it just a sole requirement for slate, but you can have these other alternatives.
right, but
Because I would have problems if it was a review of the cases.
Sure.
right, but I think what Mr. Ashby has cleared up, what I was thinking in here before, you're going to get out there. You're going to get it out there from the HPC commissioner that's going to present, and you're going to have the person who is the case. So we probably don't need to do anything. You have it, you can read and go through it tonight. So
we'll
we're
start
good.
at 5.
We'll start at 5.
This is going to be generic. We don't.
I have one more item.
You've got one more? Go ahead.
Yes, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council, I was going to ask Mr. Wright if he would just give you all just a brief update on the Churchland Bridge, which we have Wavy TV that will be interviewing Mr. Wright tomorrow and the mayor, and they may have contacted
That's
some
what I was
others
gonna
of you all. So
ask.
if you
Please.
would give us just about a few minutes, Mr. Wright can do that.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council. Just give you a brief update on the Churchland Bridge with a little history. We'll go a little back. So it has one federal bridge ID number, but it's actually 2 bridges. So with this project, it's actually going to be replacing the 1950 bridge, which is the bridge that's going towards Churchland. And that bridge will also get a separated shared use path. And the 1974 bridge was the bridge coming into town will be rehabilitated. It's a fully funded project. The approximate cost is $35.5 million. 65% of that funding comes from the state. So we only pay 35%. It's a locally administered project, which means the city controls design, procurement, and construction. VDOT is our partner in this process, so there are certain reviews that we have to go through with VDOT, and they're our main funding partner as well. It's going to be a 2-year project. The northbound lanes will take 18 months, and the rehabilitation of southbound will take 6 months. So there'll be 2 traffic shifts. The first traffic shift will be for the southbound lanes for that 6 months to take place. That's the one that had the new surface put on it.
Say that again.
The first traffic shift will be for the southbound lanes for the rehabilitation to take place. That's the bridge that was resurfaced. Once that occurs, traffic will shift over to the southbound lanes, and the 18 months will be replacement of the main bridge. We're currently pretty much in the final stages, getting ready to do procurement. So where we stand with that, we have about 15 or so state and federal agencies to get either clearances or approvals from. The Coast Guard is the federal lead, so we're waiting on their bridge permit at the moment. As soon as that permit posts for public comment, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that we'll get our permit. We're just waiting for them to get to that process. We've been assured by the Corps that once we receive the bridge permit from the Coast Guard, they're ready to issue immediately following. And with that being said, we're looking at either late July or sometime in August to go to procurement. That'll last anywhere from 45 to 60 days. So that puts us with contract award sometime towards the end of the year or construction early part of next year starting.
We've learned that Wavy says that there are people, citizens, who are concerned about the safety of the 1950 bridge. Can you talk about how safe that bridge is in its current state?
It's structurally deficient, so that means it's certain aspects of the bridge that don't meet current guidelines for today's bridge. Because it's structurally deficient, we inspect it every year as required by the state and by our federal partners. Last inspection was, I think, in April. There were no issues. So we continue to follow that process for that bridge and all our bridges until it gets to that point where you either need to do work or replace them.
Is it safe for 6 more months?
Yes.
No restrictions on it?
No restrictions, no, sir. We don't have any bridges with weight restrictions on them. However, we're still going through the findings from the report on the bridge at Paradise Creek, and we may be posting that bridge here within the next few months for weight restrictions.
Are there any specs on what it's going to look? I mean, is it going to be raised like West Norfolk? Is it going to be the same?
It's going to be approximately the same profile, because remember the 1974 bridge is staying in place, and so you don't want one bridge with a different profile sitting next to a bridge that's got a different profile.
Everybody good? So the interview is tomorrow at 9:30.
9 o'clock.
Yeah. Alrighty. Any other comments, questions for James?
No, not for him.
Thank you so much.
I got one comment, but it's not related to this. I just want to bring up a point that the week before last, we went to attended the ribbon cutting at the Sportsplex and how nice the facility was. And just one concern that I had was with all the cardio activity machines and basketball court, there was no AED at the facility. And I asked a question, they said they had one at the pool, but that's considerable distance. So I would just like us to see about providing an AED for that facility. Just adds a extra layer of protection for our citizens that are utilizing the facility.
We'll get that out there before the week is over.
Thank you.
Good. Very nice job on that, too.
Thank you all.
Yes, excellent.
All right. No further business. We're adjourned. We'll convene tomorrow at 5.